what is the attitude of Reform Judaism towards
So
Messianic Judaism?
it has changed throughout the years. In recent years, in the last 20, 30 years, we get voices in the Reform movement that say we need to accept those people and include them. They're not our enemies. I'm not saying that this is a unanimous decision or there's an article of faith about it, but you get voices. It was only 100 years ago, in the 1920s, 1930s, that the first Reform rabbis, theologians, if you will, came out with not just let's talk with Jews or have meetings with Christians and have meetings with Christians, but let's accept, just as we ask Christians to respect our faith, let's look upon their faith as valid and compatible to ours.
Shalom, this is Nehemia Gordon, and welcome to Hebrew Voices. I'm here today with Professor Yaakov Ariel of University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He is a scholar who deals with religion, religious movements, and he was scheduled to give a lecture at the World Congress of Jewish Studies in Jerusalem in 2022, and it was reported that it was going to be about the relationship between Messianic Judaism and Reform Judaism. I was very excited to hear this lecture, and he got sick and had COVID. And so now I want to hear what the topic is about. I'll be honest, Professor Ariel, I arranged this interview so I could hear your lecture, or at least the gist of it, what the topic is about.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me, and I'm excited to be here, and I'm happy to share my thoughts. And let's start with perhaps Reform Judaism and its attitudes towards Messianic Judaism.
Can you first define what Reform Judaism is? Because some of my audience... Okay, beautiful.
That's what I want to do. Reform Judaism came on the scene. Its very, very early appearances were in the early 19th century in European countries, but and occasionally even in the small, growing American Jewish community, but it really took off the ground in the mid-19th century and became a large and influential movement in a number of countries, such as Germany, in Hungary, in occasionally also France, but and a few more European countries, in a little bit in England, but mostly the United States, where it became a large, influential, normative Jewish expression and set of communities. Contrary, I would say, to very common perception among more traditionalist Jews, among Orthodox Jews, Reform Judaism did not come to abolish or to flatten Judaism, not from its own perspective. It's in many ways a movement that came to preserve Judaism in face of other alternatives, because Judaism was facing certain groups and certain movements, and certain Jews were facing a crisis following emancipation, allowing Jews to become full-fledged citizens, following Jews trying to move over into the center of European or American societies, and sensing the traditional forms of Judaism, as they've been known in the 18th century, for example, among mostly Ashkenazi Jews, don't fit anymore, and the Jews are moving away from them anyhow, and are then left sometimes with if they search for spiritual, theological, communal meaning and frameworks, are attracted to Christianity. So there was that element too of posing and suggesting a Jewish alternative to modernization, to embracing ideas of the Enlightenment, to becoming a successful burghers in, let's say, Germany, or citizens in America within the midst of what became somewhat more accepting, more inclusive society, in which there were still a lot of prejudices against the Jews and obstacles to Jewish participation, but the Jews were not anymore in the ghetto. The Jews were not anymore in their own, were not anymore restricted to certain professions or barred from the universities, the professions and the guilds, but we're now entering the more urban, competitive, industrialized, modernized scene as energetic, entrepreneurial citizens.
And let me just jump in there and maybe for the audience explain that, and correct me if this is wrong, because I deal more with biblical history and medieval history, but Jews before the Reform movement, and certainly before the Emancipation, if let's say they had questions about the rabbinical authorities, who were essentially their overlords, they didn't really have the freedom to ask those questions, did they? I mean, I think, for example, they did. They did.
There's a whole history of response. Jews came to the rabbis didn't always also agree with each other. It's not as if traditional Judaism was fully uniform. There were geographical, cultural variations, linguistic variations, but Jews were Jews. They were separated from mainstream societies. There was not just a social burial; there was a legal burial.
Right, but the point is that if you ask too many questions or the wrong kinds of questions, you could, like somebody I think of like Ariel da Costa, you could find yourself excommunicated from the Jewish community, and that was the only game in town.
Yes, but Ariel da Costa, to bring another example, such as Benedictus Baruch Spinoza, talking about 17th century Dutch Jews in Amsterdam, they didn't just ask questions. They didn't come to the rabbis to ask questions. They expressed ideas that were in contradiction to the assumed mainstream, I would say even the core, the fundamental beliefs and understandings and exegesis, not only of Jews, but also of Christians. When Spinoza writes his political theological tractate and say, no, the Bible is written by men. He didn't say persons, he said men or women and men. He was offensive, if you will, or challenging both to the Jewish system and the Christian system, and his first publications were in some ways anonymous, or under pseudonyms. The Jewish community invited him to explain, offered to the option of repentance, but he refused. Yirmiyahu Yovel, an historian a philosopher, is not an historian, but he wrote an historical book about Spinoza and his contemporaries, calls him the first secular Jew. But this was rather rare. This would become much more possible 150 years later, when Jews offer in certain places, Jews are offered the option of not being a member of the Jewish community, but don't have necessarily legally to find a place in another religious community.
And I guess my point was that I'm suggesting perhaps it was rare because people saw the consequences when you not just asked questions, but you made statements. And I bring example of Ariel da Costa, who challenged not the scripture, but rabbinical authority, and was accused of being a Karaite and found himself excommunicated. And so I guess my point is that I've always understood the Reform movement as a context in which people could make statements, not just ask questions, but make statements contrary to the rabbinical authorities.
Well, so
is that right or is that wrong?
No, I don't. Okay, so it's right and wrong at the same time, but you have your own agenda, I see, even as we talk about Reform Judaism.
I just know more about Ariel da Costa because he was accused of being a Karaite, right? It's not that I have an agenda. I want to put the Reform movement in its historical context.
I want to say a few things about the Reform movement. The Reform movement did not. Many of the major early Reform leaders, including in America, the most striking example in this regard would be Isaac Mayer Wise, who is in many ways one of the Dayans, one of the leaders, one of the Reform Judaism in America in the second half of the 19th century, he was insisting that Torah was given to Moses in Sinai.
Okay.
And but not only Reform Jews continued. This is important to realize in relation to Messianic Judaism. Reform Jews continued to understand Judaism. In fact, more so than later on. In the 19th century, early 20th century, they insisted that the Jewish people are the chosen people, that the Jewish people are in covenant with God, that the Judaism is a holy nation, like a nation of priests, a holy nation, Am Kohanim Vegoy Kadosh, and that it has its obligations and its, I would say, almost manifest destiny, if I can borrow a term from American history. And they actually preserved the ethos, the internal ethos of Judaism. They preserved the notion, or they even assumed the notion that in spite of deciding at the end that the Talmud is not abiding, the Torah is abiding, but not the Talmud, they very often saw themselves as continuers of the old rabbinical tradition that was turning Judaism, the Second Temple period and beyond, turning Judaism always, reinterpreting Judaism and turning it more attuned to the demands and needs and thoughts of the day. In some ways, they saw themselves as heirs and continuers of the Pharisees, of the early rabbi. At the same time that they eventually decided that the Talmud is an abiding, that you are entitled to move away from rabbinical decrees if you find them to be not answering the questions of the day. And so in many ways, Reform Judaism continued traditional Judaism in a different way than Orthodoxy. Orthodoxy was also a new movement of the 19th century, a reinterpretation of Judaism in the name of tradition. I mean, people there to uphold tradition more even than before in the face, as you put it, of alternatives, both within Judaism and outside of Judaism. But the Reform tradition, its internal ethos is actually a continuation of the Mishnaic period in which major sages reinterpreted the tradition and reinterpreted the laws and reinterpreted or recreated the internal ethos. And at the same time that they were willing to move, sometimes more gradually and moderately, sometimes more decisively, from rabbinical halachic Judaism of the 18th century or of their time. A lot of the changes had to do with adjusting, if you will, Judaism to the needs of now involved burghers or citizens in places like Germany or Hungary or the United States or England, in which the idea wasn't really to move out of the synagogue, but to reframe, repackage the synagogue. In some ways, some people would accuse rabbinical Judaism of being Karaites. Some accused rabbinical Judaism, in spite of the fact that many rabbis
You mean Reform Judaism?
Yes, of Reform Judaism of being Karaite, in spite of the fact that quite a number of Reform rabbis were not crazy about the Karaites, and did not see themselves as continuing in the direction of the Karaites. They were changing, if you will, rabbinical Judaism, moderately, partially, and they were continuers of rabbinical Judaism. They continued the idea of rabbis and the idea of smicha, of ordination. And they, in fact, one of the reasons that Reform Judaism in America had already early proponents, even I would say before its time, but could really move into reform only following only in the 1850s, 60s, 70s, 80s, is the fact that they needed rabbis to come from Europe who would be liberal Reform rabbis to make the changes. The authority of the rabbis, the social, moral authority of the rabbis remained. The early Reform rabbis were patriarchs of their communities. They were erudite. They were well educated. The first generation were well educated in Jewish law and Jewish lore and in the Jewish texts, but they took upon themselves the authority to make changes to the synagogue, to liturgy, deciding there's no need for the musaf, the repetitive, or I don't know if to call it repetitive, the repetition or the additional prayer that very often repeats the morning prayer in weekly gatherings. They decided that the reading from the Torah doesn't have to, and again, when I say they, it's not everyone and everywhere and all at once, but they decided that you can go back to Second Temple Judaism, to Mishnaic or to post-Second Temple Judaism, to Mishnaic time, and read the Torah in a cycle of 3 years, as it used to be, instead of as a cycle of 1 year.
Let me ask you this. So you're describing 19th century early Reform movement that in Judaism, that they see the Torah as binding, but not the Talmud as binding. Would you say that is still the characteristic of Reform Judaism today in the 21st century?
Even the Talmud is not binding. I would say it is even more 20th century than 19th century.
Okay.
Today there is a consensus that Talmud isn't binding, but the Torah is binding. Although in reality, Reform Judaism in the last half a century went in both directions, both reintroducing, reincorporating all their traditional rights and ways, and in some levels going towards further reform, for example, over women rabbis, admission of and ordination of LGBTQ. I think that you see that in both directions. The truth is, I think that Reform Judaism allowed itself both to preserve much of Judaism, its spirit and its ethos, but also to move away whenever it found it necessary. I think speaking about Torah versus Talmud is sometimes arbitrary, because when things in the Torah didn't seem nobody there would have dreamed of preserving some of the laws of Leviticus. But I think that the preservation of the Torah is preservation of, the most important is not the laws or regulations, is the narrative, preserving the historical narrative of a nation chosen by God, embodied and then embodied and directed to take upon itself more missions and more restrictions and more proactive actions that we would call the law, which is both restrictions and proactive actions, than other nations.
So you're saying if someone in the audience were to go to a Reform rabbi here in the United States and ask them, what is your approach towards the Torah? They would say the Torah is binding. That's what you're saying?
They would say, I don't think that this is a question that comes out today when a person goes to a Reform rabbi today. Reform rabbis today don't issue halacha the same way that Orthodox rabbis would. They put enormous emphasis, particularly in the last half century, on individual authority and individual choices. They might tell you, you make your own choices on A, B, and C. Some things you don't make your own choices on. But usually you won't come and ask if you're allowed to kill. The answer is unequivocally no.
What about, am I allowed to eat shrimp if I ask the Reform rabbi?
And you come to a Reform rabbi, he would tell you something that already rabbis at the turn of the 20th century said, and this is that the laws, dietary laws, are antiquated. And it's up to you. You can keep kosher if you want to, and you can eat at your heart's choice if you feel that your conscience allows you. Reform Judaism move away. Reform Judaism today can be compared, not just compared within Judaism to Orthodox Judaism, Conservative Judaism, or to Reconstructionist Judaism, or to Messianic Judaism. Reform Judaism today can also be compared to a whole series of progressive, liberal Christian groups in America. Unitarians. This is a comparison that was already came about in the 19th century. Many Jews asked themselves whether they should become Unitarians or join the Reform movement.
I don't know if that helps me. I know a lot. I think I know more about the Reform movement than I do about Unitarians. So.
That's okay. That's okay. Or to give you the example of Anglican, Quaker, not all of them, but Anglican, Quaker, Episcopalian in America, Episcopalian, Quaker, Presbyterian USA, etc., groups in America, Protestant groups mostly, that also put an emphasis on individual choices.
So this raises a really interesting question. So if the Reform rabbi would say it's up to you whether you decide whether to eat pork or to eat shrimp, would they say the same thing? And I guess about being LGBTQ and all those other issues, would they say the same thing about believing in Jesus, which brings the topic up No. Okay,
no.
So help us understand that.
Okay, no. One of the traditional elements, in many ways, as I said, Reform Judaism introduced many novelties, allowed itself a lot of choice when it came to issues of the synagogue, liturgy, moved to the vernacular, in the vernacular. As I said, there's also been a retraction and going back to older times in some ways, but it allowed itself many, many innovations. It continued with innovations into female rabbis and LGBTQ rabbis, and one of the major changes in the 1970s has been recognition of children of mixed marriages who grew up Jewish as Jews. This touches on a major issue: who is a Jew? In that, incidentally, they're very similar to Messianic Jews. Some rabbis in the last particularly 2 decades are willing to officiate in mixed marriages, which is again very popular among liberal Christians, including Catholic priests, and not just liberal Protestants, in which there are sometimes 2 clergy persons, and like a Jew and a Catholic and a Protestant, and so on and so forth. It has put increasingly more emphasis, particularly since the 1960s and 70s, on individual choices, on personal choices. It does not insist on dietary laws. There are many Reform Jews who are what you would call kosher light. They won't eat ham, they won't eat shrimp, but they don't have a separate, in their kitchen, separate sets for meat and dairy. Some few also are more or less fully kosher, but usually Reform synagogues are kosher, perhaps not by Orthodox standards, but are more or less kosher by even Orthodox standards within the sanctuary. That is, they would not serve shrimps in a synagogue buffet.
I mean, you know the famous story of the Treifa banquet, I'm assuming.
Yeah, I know the story, and it was following the Treifa banquet, which was a mistake, which happened by mistake, that then Isaac Mayer Wise and other people said, hey, they didn't eat shrimps, but they said, this is not really important. Whoever pays attention nowadays to dietary, to antiquated dietary laws, etc., etc. But actually, in the 19th century, most reform, certainly the reform rabbinically led, did keep kosher in essence, even if it didn't consider it to be essential.
I had an interesting encounter. I was speaking at a synagogue in Ohio, and I asked them, they invited me to come and read from the Torah, and I said, I don't know what your traditions are here. It was unaffiliated, which I wasn't sure what that was. And I said, what do you want me to do? Do you want me to wear a talit, a kippah? They said, here's how we're different than the Reform synagogue down the road. They said they won't allow you to wear a kippah or a talit. In our synagogue, you decide and you choose whether you want to wear a kippah and a talit, which I was shocked at because, I lived for many years in Israel in Baca. And if you went to the local Reform synagogue there,
Kol
Neshama, everyone there is the women are wearing kippahs, let alone the men. And so
in many Reform synagogues, there are talitot and there are kippot. And it's not that they don't allow. It used to be perhaps 100 years ago.
No, this was a few years ago in Ohio where this is.
Yeah, but what they told you about the Reform synagogue down the road was not accurate.
That it's very possible.
Was not accurate.
So you're saying that's not okay.
That was not accurate. I know Reform synagogue, which you don't have to wear a talit, but if you go up for the Torah, if you go on the bima, you do wear a talit.
Okay. Maybe this is like the, some of the European explorers who everywhere they went, they would say they're cannibals because, when you're describing the other, you tend to exaggerate and maybe dehumanize.
That is correct.
All right.
Anyway, I want to come to the point that when it came to Christianity, 19th century Reform Judaism and even early 20th century Reform Judaism was very much a traditionalist Jewish community. The understanding was Christianity is misinterpretation of it's misinterpretation of the Torah, of the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible. It moved away. It is not a legitimate expression of Israelite religion. It's there's not anger on Jesus in the 19th century. It's very interesting. There's willing to reclaim Jesus. At the same time, there's a lot of anger at Paul, who kind of moved Christianity away, moved Jesus' disciples away from Judaism, at least according to Reform understanding and to many other Jewish understandings. And there is a lot of anger, not just disclaimer, but a lot of anger on evangelism of Jews. This was understood as encroachment on Jewish integrity and Jewish pride. Telling Jews your religion isn't worth much was seen as part of Christian animosity towards Judaism and Christian triumphalism. Only we count, only we know the way. So there's huge anger, as there traditionally has often been, against Jews that embraced Christianity and were propagating the faith, and against Jews who claim to be Jewish while they're Christian. Nobody understood that, I would say, except in negative terms. There, amazingly, in America of the second half of the 19th century, there wasn't an anti-missionary, an anti-converted Jews crusader more than the Reform leader Isaac Mayer was. If you read what he wrote he edited a journal and he published books, and he was sarcastic
Mm-hmm.
He just hated those people. He was in Cincinnati. And if he heard that there's, a preacher coming to preach to the Jews, or especially if that person was Jewish, he described those people as crooks, because the Jewish understanding very often was that only the Jews cannot sincerely adopt Christianity. If they do it, it's for social mobility. And if they become missionaries, it's playing tricks on their old brothers and sisters.
Let me ask you this. So you're describing this Rabbi Weiss. Tell us who he is. I'm not sure most of my audiences know who that is.
So you spoke about the Trefa banquet.
Yeah.
But he was a prestigious rabbi in Cincinnati, founder of the first rabbinical seminary, rabbinical school in America, which he intended it to be the rabbinical school for everyone in America, the Hebrew Union College. He was a founder of a number of American Jewish organizations, one of the first people to attempt to unite and bring together and create American Judaism, one of the first to write an American prayer book, Minhag America, the American way, the American version. He was not the most radical reformer. He was working against such people as David Einhorn, who was much more radical than he was. He wrote an alternative prayer book, Olat Tamid. But in some ways, in spite of the fact that Wise were more a moderate reformer, they were in some ways similar. They were both there to preserve Judaism as a distinct religious community, as a covenant people. Wise's successor at the Hebrew Union College was the son-in-law of David Einhorn, Kaufman Kohler, who was a first-rate scholar of early Christianity, and had lots of respect for what you could call the Jesus movement, but not necessarily for the Christianity that came out of Pauline theology and Christology. And certainly did not appreciate the Trinity.
So Rabbi Weiss and these other Reform leaders you're saying were in the 19th century vehemently opposed to Jews.
In the early 20th.
Early 20th. They were opposed to Jews who become Christians. What then is the approach of Reform, which is the crux of your lecture that you were going to give? We spent the whole time right now explaining what Reform Judaism is.
Reform Judaism, well until the turn of the 21st century, was anti-Messianic Judaism. There is a book by David Einhorn, a Reform rabbi, not of the 19th century, early 20th century, but a late 20th century rabbi, a rabbi in the second half of the 20th century, who wrote a book about the attempts to evangelize the Jews in America, the attempts to about congregations of Jewish believers in Jesus, Messianic Jews, about such leaders, such personalities. This is, I'll put it moderately and carefully.
Yeah.
He could not take that movement seriously. He could not treat it respectfully. He was very suspicious of Jews who considered themselves to be Jewish at the same time that they accepted faith in Jesus. And
Mhm.
his book, very much like following in the what I would call the Isaac Mayer Wise tradition, in spite of the fact that there is 100 years difference at times between things they wrote, he treats those people as insincere.
Mm.
He did not really give much credibility to the claim to be sincere followers of Jesus, and at the same time wishing to maintain their ties with the Jewish community, to maintain elements of Jewish culture, of Jewish languages, and did not take very seriously their, what you could call it Christian Zionism, but you can also call it support for the Zionist movements at the time, being part of the Zionist movement. He could not understand that because it was not something that people understood until very recent years. People continued, including in the Reform movement, to view the attempts to evangelize Jews as attempts of delegitimizing Judaism and Jews as non-Christians.
There are
The
attempts like that, though. I mean, to be
Reform
fair,
rabbis were particularly sensitive because they were accused of deluding Judaism. They were accused of moving away from normative Judaism. They were very often blamed for quote unquote assimilation. You become a Reformed Jew, you don't treat the tradition seriously. The next step, there's intermarriage. The third step, there's conversion. They felt that they needed to distance themselves from the elements in the Jewish community that are accepting Christianity, that are
that's interesting.
that are moving away from the faith. One of their aims has been, from the very beginning, is to pose alternative to assimilation, to pose alternative to Christianization. Here they see Jews that advocate openly amalgamation of Judaism and Christianity, which until the turn of the 21st century, people could not understand. And I think there's more understanding today because there are many, for two reasons. One is that you know very well that joining religious communities became a matter of choice, not of birth or of a tribal just affiliation or loyalty. There's an individual choice involved, commitment. And this is very sincere. A. B. There is American religious groups are very often hybrid. Most of the new groups, particularly that came out of the counterculture, Asian groups that have recreated themselves in America, to root in America, Buddhist groups, Hindu groups, various Christian groups. There are nowadays groups that didn't exist until quite recently, of like groups that promote both indigenous American traditions and rituals with Christianity. It used to be that you had to move.
Let me ask you this. So you mentioned that earlier on in the 19th and 20th century, there was this feeling of that what we today would call Messianic Judaism, right? Let's be careful. I don't know that it was called that in the 19th century for sure, like Hebrew Christians maybe, that it delegitimized Judaism. And I feel like we spent the whole first half talking about reform, and now we have to get into the Messianic Judaism and its relationship.
Absolutely.
So let me ask this. So isn't there something about it that really did delegitimize Judaism? Like, I've been approached by missionaries who say, if you want to be a completed Jew, you have to believe in Jesus. That inherently delegitimizes Judaism, doesn't it?
Well, that is the not just $1 million question. It's by now with inflation the $1 billion question.
Okay.
It's I put a lot of premium on people's intentions, on what they feel, what they think.
Okay.
From their perspective, Jewish believers in Jesus today are sincere followers of Jesus. Many of them have also gone. Many of them most of them have gone what you could call the evangelical way of establishing a personal relationship with Jesus, being born again in Christ, whatever. There are many definitions in many ways. At the same time, that they sincerely see themselves as Jews. Mm-hmm. That it's not just a few hundred congregations, few hundreds. For the size of American Jewry, that's a lot. A few hundred congregations, tens of thousands of members. Mm-hmm. I'm going to be provocative. Yeah. It's also their interest, sometimes renewed interest, in learning Hebrew and learning Jewish history, in learning about the Holocaust and its details, mm-hmm. Watching movies, reading books, taking courses at the university on Jewish themes. I will be provocative for a second, just to put things in an extreme way for a moment, and then go back to your question about Messianic Judaism, which is not one thing.
Of course not.
And it's not one thing. It's not unified and uniformed completely at all. Mm-hmm. But also, like Reform Judaism, like all religious groups, is dynamic and not static, and develops and changes. Let me be provocative. Most members today of what are still mostly known as Messianic congregations, Messianic synagogues, most of them were not raised Jewish. The overwhelming majority did not grow up Jewish, by which I don't mean that I don't know if it's true about the majority that they don't have any Jewish roots. I didn't say that. Mm-hmm. But there are congregations in which only a minority grew up Jewish. The movement at large has more members that did not grow up in a Jewish home. That is, they might have had a Jewish grandparent. They might have had their spouse might be Jewish, or might have come from a mixed marriage background. But then some people have and a large amount of people don't claim any Jewish roots. Those people joined communities in which some of the prayer, not all of it, is in Hebrew with translation, in which Jewish texts are read and celebrated, in which Jewish songs, very often in Hebrew, are sang routinely, in which the Jewish calendar of meeting on the Jewish Sabbath and celebrating the Jewish holidays is maintained, in which the Jewish symbols, Star of David, and menorah, shofar, in which sometimes in the social hour, the meal or the celebration or the snacks that are offered after either Friday night meeting, which they call very often oneg, or on Saturday noon, early afternoon, they very often eat Jewish delicacies as they are understood in America, including the ubiquitous bagel. And I mean, you probably know that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob ate bagels every day.
One of my major culture shocks is when I moved to Israel in 1993, you couldn't get a good bagel. And I couldn't understand it. I'm in the Jewish state and you can't get a bagel in Jerusalem.
Right.
Back then.
And they, in many ways, they are, and where there are lectures on Jewish themes, where there are tours, organized tours to Israel, where they sometimes participate in choirs, dance groups that sing and dance Israeli or Jewish songs. They're also, of course, Messianic. There's also, of course, a unique Messianic culture. But I will make now a provocative claim. Those people, you stay in such community for 20, 30 years. And in effect, there's a question, who converted to what? Those are Christians who adhere to faith in Jesus, and they maintain that faith, but they are becoming culturally Jewish. They are joining the Jewish fold.
That's interesting that you say that. That's really interesting you say that. I've seen.
Who's
it's very interesting.
evangelizing whom? Who is
Yeah.
evangelizing whom?
Yeah.
I mean, it goes both direction. What I'm saying is, you also have to look at people's sincerity. Some people are very comfortable with this hybridity. Yes, many Jews accept Jesus and they go on to non-Jewish communities. And while they perhaps identify as Jewish, it's a question whether they can transmit that to further generations. But the Messianic Jewish community has built a whole network with summer camps and publications and websites and music.
Would it be fair to say that some Messianic Jews are more active in Judaism than non-Messianic Jews?
Totally.
I mean, that seems to be the case.
Totally. Much more so than unaffiliated Jews. They participate in a Jewish community, a community that sees itself in connection with Jewish history, with Jewish covenant with God, which they recognize, with the Jewish state as it is today. They learn Hebrew to some extent or a greater extent. They are more affiliated with things Jewish than many other Jews. I think to dismiss that is wrong.
Yeah. So Reform Judaism is the largest denomination of Jews in the United States. What is the attitude of Reform Judaism towards Messianic Judaism?
It has changed throughout the years. In recent years, in the last 20, 30 years, we get voices in the Reform movement that say we need to accept those people and include them. They're not our enemies. I'm not saying that this is a unanimous decision or there's an article of faith about it, but you get voices. It was only 100 years ago, in the 1920s, 1930s, that the first Reform rabbis, theologians, if you will, came out with not just let's talk with Jews or have meetings with Christians and have meetings with Christians, but let's say, just as we ask Christians to respect our faith, let's look upon their faith as valid and compatible to ours. Such people, Solomon Freehoff, to give one example. But you do find today, for the first time, a much more easygoing, accepting attitude to Messianic Judaism. It's not understood anymore as an affront to Judaism or something that we Reform Jews need to disassociate ourselves completely. There's still such an element. Very often Jewish communities don't like it when under Judaism, it used to be the telephone books. Nowadays, there are no telephone books, so the problem isn't what it was until 20 years ago. But it used to be that under, religious congregations, you'd get churches, etc., and then there would be synagogue, and a Messianic synagogue would place their information there, and the other Jewish congregations said, "Wow, no, but they're not Jewish." There isn't. I've seen in front of my eyes in the last 20, 30 years, and a more easy going attitude. I've seen, and again, it differs. When in my area in Cary, North Carolina, Jewish Messianic community was, I don't know if I would call it attacked. That would be a little bit too much, but was certainly its building. But it received threats. Its building was defaced. It could have been much, much worse.
Was it by Jews or by anti-Semites?
By anti-Semites.
Okay.
By anti-Semites. And the person responsible was caught. And I immediately sent the rabbi there a message saying that I'm horrified and he has my total sympathy, of course, he and his community. And he received dozens of such notices from members and leaders in the Jewish community, but not from all. Not from all.
Okay.
So there's this is still an issue, of course, I would say, but I think that the late 20th century, early 21st century brought with it a better understanding that there is such a reality. It's a reality of not just Christians who were Jewish. This has been the reality for hundreds and hundreds of years, but that there is a community and a culture and
So if somebody
interpretation
can,
of Judaism, a contemporary interpretation of Judaism that is actively Jewish and involved with Jewish matters, at the same time that it places Jesus at the heart of its spirituality.
so yeah, it's very interesting. This has been a fascinating conversation, Professor. Thank you so much. Any final words you want to share with the audience about this?
Well, first of all, again, thank you for inviting me, for allowing me to share my thoughts. And this is an opportunity for me. I hope I did so very, very freely. No censorship, no inhibition, telling you what I think, what I feel.
Appreciate that.
And I hope that this is well received and that people show the same tolerance towards my ideas that I show towards their faith and beliefs.
Well, thank you so much. Shalom.
You're most welcome.
You have been listening to Hebrew Voices with Nehemia Gordon. Thank you for supporting Nehemia's Makor Hebrew Foundation. Learn more at nehemiaswall.com.